Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this little topic that I found very particularly interesting. I wasn't necessarily going to talk about this topic because I was going to try and limit the Canelo Alvarez videos at least for this week because I knew I was already going to do a decent amount of them because, of course, today is fight week for Mr. Soul Canelo Alvarez. Of course, we had the very, very decent fight between himself and the very, very big Russian contender, not even just Russian contender, excuse me, the Russian champion at the light heavyweight division, I believe the WBA light heavyweight champion of the world, Mr. Dmitry Bivol. And to be honest with you, at least so far within the boxing world of this year, that might be the best matchup. That might overall be the biggest fight, in my opinion, overall of the year. Now, do I think that it's going to do as much pay per views as, maybe some of the other fights in Canelo Alvarez's history? Do I think that maybe it's going to do as many pay per views as what the Gennady Golovkin fight did? Probably not, because I don't think that Dmitry Bivol is as well known as what a Gennady Golovkin was, and he's probably not even as well known as what a David Benavidez or Jamal Charlo would be. And of course, that leads to certain people basically saying, well, why would he not fight those guys? That just proves that Canelo Alvarez is avoiding those guys. And this is why I do so many videos on Mr. Sewell and Canelo Alvarez, because you have to be very, very careful with who you get your information from. And especially in the sport of boxing, really almost any sport that you watch in general, whether you watch ESPN First Take, Skip and Shannon Undisputed, no matter what it is, there's always some sports analyst out there that's going to try to push some bullshit out there and spoon feed you a bunch of horse shit because most people are usually agenda driven because of their narrative, whether it be a racial issue, whether it be an emotional issue, or they're a fanboy of someone, or although they hate someone else when it comes down to it. You have to be very, very careful who you get your information from, especially in that of the sport of boxing. Because in the sport of boxing, of course, including a lot of these channels that I usually tend to review, they have a very, very, very big emotional and racial issue. And that tends to be about 90% of the channels that I tend to review, whether it be Dante's Boxing Nation or Aki TV or Boxing Ego. They basically don't like Canelo Alvarez because they don't want Canelo Alvarez to be remembered as the number one pound for pound fighter of this generation. And Canelo, once again, was not the only fighter that they went after when this was happening. They also went after Vasily Lomachenko. They still go after Tyson Fury to this day because he is a main threat to the pound for pound rankings. Let me also explain myself there because I get certain people that come in my comment section and overall they basically tell me, they say, oh, well, it sounds like you have a problem against black fighters when it comes down to it. No, I don't really have a problem with black fighters. All I'm basically telling you is what these channels like Dante's Boxing Nation and the LDBC and New Media, all I'm basically telling you is the truth about them, which is basically, and once again, a certain amount of people, they may not like my terminology for it, but it just is what it is. All they are is a pro-black cult. And I get certain people over on here and say, well, what's wrong with being pro-black? What's wrong overall with rooting for your own kind? Well, there's nothing wrong with rooting for your own kind. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. The problem comes in is when you clearly have a very big racial issue and you very clearly overall are in your emotions. And a lot of the times you're going to try to spread these bullshit narratives overall about these certain fighters because let's just be real. You don't want someone like a Canelo Alvarez to be the number one pound for pound fighter. When you spread these bullshit narratives about how Canelo Alvarez, he faces these repeated bums, even though once upon a time you thought that these fighters were very decent fighters. All of a sudden, Canelo Alvarez fights them, and all of a sudden they're not as good anymore. So you can just tell if you watch their videos often enough here and there, you can tell that most of these channels are full of shit. They're always going to be full of shit, especially when it comes to a topic like this, because they don't like Canelo Alvarez. They're very, very racially motivated. They're not objective. They're not logical. And that's why whatever Canelo Alvarez does, they're never going to be happy with him because it's basically the same thing with what Floyd Mayweather Jr. was dealing with when he was the number one pound for pound fighter. People were not going to be happy no matter what Floyd Mayweather Jr. did in the sport of boxing because he was the true number one pound for pound fighter. And that's how you knew, overall Floyd was the true number one pound for pound fighter because overall, basically, the limit, or not the limitations, excuse me, the standards, excuse me, that's what I meant to say, but the standards on Floyd Mayweather Jr., that were placed upon him. There were certain people that were saying that he should fight a middleweight fighter when he pretty much was a natural 140 pounder. So that really tells you overall how great Floyd Mayweather Jr. was. Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, is in a very, very similar situation. And of course, we have this recent topic, we have this recent narrative that allegedly Canelo Alvarez, that he avoided Errol Spence Jr. because apparently he turned down a deal, which I believe, potentially he did turn down a deal, but do I believe that Canelo Alvarez, do I believe that he's avoiding Errol Spence Jr.? No, not whatsoever. Now, of course, the LDBC and new media, they're going to run with that because they've been running with this narrative that Canelo Alvarez, that he avoids the best of the best fighters anyway, especially black fighters. That's what they always try to allege when it comes down to it. But anyways, I just find it very, very interesting because, first of all, we're just going to talk about the potentiality of there being an Errol Spence Jr. versus Canelo Alvarez fight. Do any of us who think rationally and logically, do any of us really overall think that that is the best fight for either or of them to make right now? And to be quite honest with you, I don't think that Canelo Alvarez, I don't think that he is really worrying about Errol Spence Jr. right now. I think that he has bigger fish to fry. I think he has bigger things on his plate. I think the way that Canelo Alvarez looks at it, he says, listen, if me and Errol Spence Jr. are going to fight, that's even if he can get past Terrence Bud Crawford. And that's another thing. Errol Spence Jr., he really should not even be worrying about Canelo Alvarez right now. He should be worrying about trying to unify those welterweight titles because he has Terrence Bud Crawford problems right now, not Canelo Alvarez problems. If he has Canelo Alvarez problems, that'll be 2 to 3 years later on down the line. All right? It just is what it is. Canelo Alvarez right now has Dimitri Bivol and R2B problems. And also Gennady Golovkin and more than likely Ilunga Makabu. So we'll see all know what ends up happening there. Those are more than likely going to be Canelo Alvarez's plans within these next couple of years. And then after that, more than likely he's going to face Jamal Charlo and that of David Benavidez. But I think that Canelo Alvarez, I think that he sees a golden opportunity to unify that of the light heavyweight division. I think that he's going to try to go after Dimitri Bivol first. Then he's going to settle business with that Gennady Golovkin trilogy. Then he's probably overall going to take, the Ilunga Makabu fight, which I don't think is, I don't think that Makabu is necessarily a great fighter by any means, but it is interesting because we will then get to see how Canelo handles a cruiserweight fighter like Makabu, and we'll get to see if he wins an official title in the 5th weight class. So that'll be very, very particularly interesting. But anyways, I just find this narrative so interesting about how these guys, they claim that Errol Spence Jr. is now being ducked by Canelo Alvarez. If Canelo Alvarez and Errol Spence Jr. really were to fight right now, do any of us really think that these channels would really give Canelo Alvarez the credit of beating Errol Spence Jr., who is naturally at least 2, maybe even 3 weight classes below that of a Saul Canelo Alvarez? Do we really think that these channels all in all who bitch and moan all the time about how when Floyd Mayweather Jr. fought him, he had all these disadvantages because he was 2 weight classes lower? Are we really going to allege, all in all, just because it fits your narrative, that Canelo was really avoiding Errol Spence Jr., even though he's facing the 175-pound champion in Dimitri Bivol? And, of course, the Jamal Charlo and David Benavidez fights, I think that those fights are excellent fights as well. Just to talk about all 3 of those fights really quickly, and when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, and I've already explained this, I really am not even going to count Errol Spence Jr. or Terrence Bud Crawford in that conversation because I really don't think that either of them really should be facing Canelo Alvarez, even overall if they do get a little bit heavier, but that's going to be up to them eventually. We'll see all in all what they end up doing. But just to talk about David Benavidez and Jamal Charlo, even though they certainly would do big with the numbers because they're both American fighters, I don't think that they have any more of a realistic chance than Dimitri Bivol. In fact, to be quite honest with you, I give Dimitri Bivol about a good 40, maybe even 50% chance over Canelo. The chance that I give David Benavidez and Jamal Charlo, at the most, I give him a 30% chance. And to be quite honest with you, that's even being generous. Because David Benavidez, in my view, he's a very straightforward fighter when it comes down to it that lacks a great amount of defense. Everyone always tries to talk to you about his power, but he really does not have a great power. He's a person on the know that can be hurt. He can be knocked down. Don't get me wrong. That's not me saying that the fight is not a great fight. But is it David Benavidez win in terms of legacy, in terms of skill set? Is it as big as a win as Dimitri Bivol? No, absolutely not. It's just not. All right. And obviously, I'm not the only one that agrees with that because Dante's Boxing Nation, who's one of these sleazeballs that try to feed you, these narratives full of shit. He tries to feed you the spoonful of shit. He even said in, one video that I ended up reviewing of him one time, and I have the evidence to prove this, where he said that there was 2 fighters, in his opinion, that would beat Canelo Alvarez hands down. And he said that he didn't believe that Canelo would go up to light heavyweight because it was too challenging. He said that the 2 fighters that he believed would beat Canelo hands down were either A. Demetrius Bubble Andrade or B. Dimitri Bivol. And what happened when Canelo Alvarez was announced that his next fight was against Bivol? He said, "Oh well, he must have thought that he was the easier challenge compared to that of Jamal Charlo or David Benavidez." So get the fuck out of here with that shit. So once again, if that doesn't prove to you that these guys that they don't have a personal and racial issue with Canelo Alvarez, then it just is what it is. All right, it's whatever. But at the end of the day, once again, these guys are not going to like Canelo Alvarez. Now just to talk about Errol Spence Jr., and we're going to talk about Jamal Charlo here in a minute as well. But just to talk about Errol Spence Jr., I think that he's a great fighter. I think that he's a spectacular fighter. I don't think that he would really ever have that great of a chance over Canelo Alvarez. And some people may bring up the point. They may say, "Oh well, why would you say that?" Because Floyd Mayweather Jr., he ended up beating Canelo Alvarez and someone quite handily several years ago, and he was, a couple weight divisions smaller than Canelo Alvarez. Yes, but what some people don't mention is that when you have a fighter that sometimes is smaller, but also extremely good defensively and quick, and also has the reach that a Floyd Mayweather Jr. has with the 72-inch arm reach, it actually gives you more advantages than would appear to that of the naked eye. Because Floyd Mayweather Jr. was quicker with his hands, he also was quicker overall with his defense, he was quicker overall with his feet, had better footwork overall than Canelo. So it really was just a bad matchup for Canelo Alvarez to begin with, because Floyd just has that type of style, especially with his speed and his size, that was always going to give Canelo Alvarez problems. The thing is about Errol Spence Jr. is that he's not really a Floyd Mayweather Jr. Now, he's a great fighter. That's not me, trying to detract from Errol Spence whatsoever, but he doesn't really remind me of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. He almost reminds me of a smaller version of Marvin Hagler. That's what he reminds me of. He doesn't have the foot speed of Floyd Mayweather Jr., nowhere close. He doesn't have the hand speed. He doesn't have the defense of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. I don't see how Errol Spence Jr. lasts the whole entire 12 rounds over Canelo. I don't see it. I don't see it. And once again, Errol Spence Jr., he doesn't need to worry about Canelo Alvarez right now. He's got Terrence Bud Crawford problems to deal with. And then after Terrence Bud Crawford problems to deal with, he's got overall Jamal Charlo or Brian Castano, problems to deal with. So we'll see what happens there. We'll see. But anyways, when it comes down to it, I think the Errol Spence Jr. fight, I think that will be a terrific fight. But let's not go on this bullshit narrative about how Canelo was apparently avoiding Errol Spence Jr. You know damn well that you would not give Canelo Alvarez credit for that fight anyway. And that you would find a way to criticize Canelo Alvarez for facing Errol Spence Jr., who very clearly is smaller than Canelo at this point in time in his career, about 2 weight classes lower. So come on, let's stop the bullshit. All right? It is what it is. And then just talking about Jamal Charlo, that's pretty much going to be the last bit of the video. I think that Jamal Charlo also is a very decent fighter as well. I don't see him having a legitimate chance over Canelo. I don't see him having a legitimate chance. He's very stiff, doesn't have the best of feet. He can be hurt. I think that he's a very powerful puncher, but I don't think that he's as powerful as some of the other punchers that Canelo has fought. But those are pretty much my opinions on the fights. I think that Canelo, in this Dimitri Bivol fight, he's going to be facing the most dangerous fight possible. So we'll see what happens. And that's including out of Errol Spence Jr., David Benavidez, or Jamal Charlo. Errol Spence Jr. is a fantastic boxer. He's just too small. Jamal Charlo is too limited. Same with David Benavidez. But I hope all those fights do eventually happen. But we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later. And we'll see what Canelo Alvarez does from here. Once again, I believe that after this Bivol fight, if he does win, which I do predict that he will, more than likely he'll face Gennady Golovkin in a trilogy fight. Then he'll face Lula Makabu. At least I hope that matchup happens, just to see if he can win the title of the cruiserweight. Then after that, probably Artur Beterbiev. And then after that, probably David Benavidez and Jamal Charlo. But we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.